I'll go ahead and call to order the special City Council and closed session meeting of the City Council of the City of Victorville. First item on the agenda is public comment. Anyone wishing to address the council under public comment? All right, seeing no one, we'll go to agenda item number 2. Mr. Cox.
Mr. Mayor and Council, a couple of meetings ago I indicated at the end of the regular meeting, a couple of meetings ago, I indicated to the council that we were at the point of starting a mid-year budget review, and one of the items that we had to consider for the mid-year budget review was what occurs, what happens to the existing plant, and that as a result of having 2 new members, we needed to back up and give the history of the treatment plant at the base, the experience that we have had with Victor Valley Wastewater Authority, our lack, staff's inability to get a waste discharge for the sludge, the fact that we believe there will be litigation if we divert, and we believe that diversion is necessary for that plant to become efficient, and also indicated that there probably comes, the time has arrived when we have to look at the financial impact of the plant, the income, the projections, how it affects our cash flows, the monies that we have borrowed from the Victorville Water District, why we borrowed the money, the amount of monies that we have borrowed to date, and exactly where we are at financially with the plant, and how that is going to have a domino effect on other items. We are a little bit distracted with providing information to a lot of individuals, groups and individuals requesting information because of supposed past actions that may or may not be called into question. I have indicated to the City Council when I came 2 years ago that my interest is moving from that point forward, that we had some financial problems. I did not lay those problems at anyone's feet. I have blamed no one, and I do not intend to do so because that's not my job. My job as a city manager is to find ways to meet our obligations, pay our bond indebtedness, keep the municipal services going, and I believe we had done so. I'm not going to give a presentation in regard to what we've accomplished because, interestingly enough, all the councilmen here are very much aware that we've had to lay off employees and we've had to cut back services, and we have had a tremendous team that have tried to keep the level of services going without reducing the services, and become very, very sensitive not only to the public input, but the request of the mayor and the council, and to make sure that we provide the highest level of services, and we have done so. If you will note, with the different people who have made inquiries, filed complaints with grand jury, SEC, and who knows, there has not been any complaints that I know of that have indicated that the city has dropped services or is no longer providing services that the public feels that they're entitled to. And the cash that we have to work with is the cash that makes the city run and meets our debt obligation, pays our police force, pays the fire, and pays the bond and indebtedness, and so on. There is so much misinformation that there comes a time when we have to lay on the table exactly what we are dealing with, because the City Council has very, very difficult decision-making problems in front of them and setting policies on where we go. We have indicated, staff has indicated several times, that it may be necessary to cut services. Since I have been involved in the discussion of cutting the 8 members from the police department, I've tried to explain over and over and over that we did not lay off any policemen. We did not cut the services, and I have all the assurances from our police chief that I rely on that they're not only providing the service that they've agreed to provide, they're keeping with the contract, And at this point in time, while there's never enough policemen, there is no request to fill those positions, and our statistics clearly show that crime and crime-related activities in the city are on the decline. So they have proven that they have been able to do that job. In regard to how that's affected, we talk about funding of the plant at the base, funding at I-15 interchange, at Nisqually, and funding the Green Tree extension. And again, it's all related to the funding of the plant. We did not expect that USCIS would issue a notice of determination to rescind their agreement so that we could not keep collecting the EB-5 money. And as you know, that it's on an appeal, and staff is working very hard to make sure that in our one and only chance to respond to that all the answers are going to be there. We can't possibly afford to leave any stone unturned. And once we submit the data, it will be all the data that's possibly could be submitted and answers all the questions. And I realize we could probably do it quicker, but we can't afford to make mistakes. If we look at the past decisions that I make, that the council makes, it seems like we're prone to make mistakes when we rush into things. And I realize there's a lot at stake, but we have to be certain on these issues. Back to the domino effect, when we talk about the plant at the base, I indicated that there needs to be a program as to why it exists, the commitment we made to Dr. Pepper Snapple, exactly where we're at, and why the Water District borrowed money where the city borrowed money from the Water District. Now, one of the things that has occurred, and it's been reported in the newspaper, and while we're not going to give a big presentation about it, is that it is well known that the Victor Valley Wastewater Authority, VVWRA, was authorized by the board to negotiate with the city in regard to the purchase of the plant. At this time, to clear the air, we do not have an offer on the table, and we do not have negotiations that are meaningful at this point. The second thing is that there has been discussions that we need a sludge agreement, and after working on that for 18 months, no, 2 years, Jean reminds me, we still don't have that. And I do not want to step on anyone's toes, but I have said over and over that there's going to come a time when this council makes a very, very difficult decision, because it was my belief after about 6-7 months into those negotiations that staff was batting its head against the wall and would not be able to reach any kind of meaningful solution. We couldn't come to a conclusion in regard to the negotiations, because each time there was a meeting, there appeared to be new ideas, new suggestions, new questions that came out of the air. And I finally concluded as follows. It's impossible to get a sludge agreement. It's impossible to get any kind of an agreement because of the fear that City of Victorville would not vote to help finance the sub-regional plants in Apple Valley and Hesperia. I do believe that's the case. It hasn't been publicly discussed except by me. I think those kind of considerations deserve a public discussion because of what it financially will mean to the citizens of Victorville. And while we're looking at selling bonds or trying to find financing for the Victor Valley wastewater plant, or for our plant at the George Air Force Base, we have to remember that there's an organization that's been authorized to make an offer, and the City Council needs to know about that. We would be required to probably spend another $3 million to have the sludge agreement. And staff has encouraged Rudy Cabriales, Councilman Cabriales, as our representative on the VVWRA, to continue that agreement with the VVWRA as long as we possibly can, because if we arrive at a permanent sludge agreement, we have thrown a sludge agreement with VVWRA, we've effectively thrown away $3 million. And so it doesn't make any sense, if we can get a sludge agreement to discharge sludge, that we would build our own sludge facilities. And it's $3 million that we don't have laying around, but we can find the $3 million if we have to. But if we decide to go ahead and build that, well, then we need to divert to make that plant become efficient. We need to have more flow. And if we have more flow and it becomes sufficient, you need to know that in the circles that I'm negotiating in, there has been the discussion that that could be litigated because we're diverting from the plant. And I have said many, many times, and I wasn't joking, that we have been informed that when the flow goes up at the Victor Valley Wastewater Plant, the cost goes up, and when the flow goes down, the cost goes up, and we don't buy it. But we're at that hard decision. We're at that point in time where we're going to lay out to the City Council the first domino, and we don't know which ones are going to fall from this point forward. And we need to discuss on, are we going to build that sludge plant and spend the $3 million? Because if you do, there is no reason to amend the JPA. The second portion of that is that if you're not going to have a sludge agreement, you're not going to amend the portion of JPA. It's been the city attorney's ruling that they cannot sell the funds or borrow the money or sell the bonds to build the Apple Valley and the Aspire plant without the city of Victorville voting on that. And that means if the city of Victorville votes on that, we have to have a public discussion, I believe, on what it costs the citizens of Victorville to be a party to building the Apple Valley Aspire plant. That time has come where we can't avoid that because it's estimated to be $6 to $10 a month. We've not been authorized, staff-wise, have not been authorized to the council to enter into negotiations, and there's a whole myriad of subject matters that can be discussed. For example, the connection of more of Apple Valley and Hesperia through assessment districts, as Victorville did. I have informed some members of the council, but I haven't said this publicly. If you go all the way back to when 1977, when we began to enter the agreements to build the wastewater regional plant, there was a plan and a requirement that the communities start connecting the major portion of the servable area to the wastewater plant. Victorville immediately did that. They established assessment districts, and I would remind anyone and everyone that there were 5 subdivisions in Green Tree East that the City Council reached assessment district agreements with those residents, and all 5 tracts were sewered, with the city paying half and the residents paying half. In the Victor Village area, the City of Victorville had received a cease and desist because they had septic tanks in the area, and because they weren't functioning, and because of a problem during wet weather where some of those tanks would float, and a real concern, although no studies were ever completed, that it might eventually jeopardize the groundwater. The City of Victorville entered into an assessment district for that square mile and spent considerable amount of money making sure that all the houses in that complete tract, which is 1 square mile, sewers were put in on an assessment district where the city shared the burden of putting those in. The same thing happened for Green Tree North. There are 3 tracts, as I recall, where we entered into an assessment district to build the sewers. The same thing occurred with one of the very early developments north of the mall, which was called Liberty Village. Not all of Liberty Village is sewered, but the major part of it was a sewer assessment district undertaken by the city. There was an effort by this city to connect as many people as possible to the system that would flow the sewage to the wastewater treatment plant, and I believe that that was the mandate at the time. And now the question, if we're flowing 68%, can Hesperia and Apple Valley, can they do a better job? Can they have assessment districts? Do they have an interest? And exactly where are we in this role? We start today with 2 presentations. The primary presentation is Sean McGlade, who has been involved in this Victor Valley wastewater plant for as many years as he has been here. Sean and I and Amrit Jaker, Director of Public Works, has assisted Rudy on the board for the last 2 years on trying to come to agreements. One of the things that's, I think, evident, I'm not being critical, it's just factual, is that the VVWRA board is continuing forward strongly with plans to build the treatment plant in Apple Valley and Hesperia. And so what does Victorville do? Is there a benefit? Is there an indirect benefit? Is there a direct benefit? How much is it going to cost the individuals? These discussions are going to lead to those kind of discussions because there's a twofold effect, and that is operating your plant for the benefit of the base and Dr. Pepper, paying your share into the Victorville wastewater plant, and paying an increased fee in order to meet bonded indebtedness for Apple Valley and Hesperia. It's a very serious matter. And in discussing this with Councilman Cabrianos, we fully agree that at this point in time, he needs direction. Both the member and the alternate for the VVWA needs direction as to what we do because of the following. If they're moving ahead with some speed and there is no full discussion with the council, we don't want any member of the council indicating that thus and so occurred and somehow the council was kept in the dark or didn't know. We want everybody to be informed. We want the council to be informed. We want staff to be informed. And the only way to do that is start with the presentation that John is going to make at the present time. And then, as I indicated at the last meeting, Amar Jaker, who has looked at all sides of this, has a short presentation. There is some disagreements in regard to the Beth methods. They are professional differences. Both Amar and Sean want a conclusion that's best for the city. I have looked at both their work products, and I am absolutely determined that their interest is for the best interest of the city and to keep this council informed. But there's going to be some tough decisions, and it is my belief, and I have discussed this with the attorney, that it's highly unlikely that we can avoid litigation in this matter. About the only way that you can avoid litigation is to agree to fund the plant, fund the Apple Valley plant, fund the Hesperia plant, and raise the rates to pay for those bonded indebtedness. But as the city attorney pointed out, there's likely, if the council did become agreeable and become a good neighbor and agree to do that, there's very likely you'll receive litigation from individuals that have no benefit but are required to pay something where they receive no benefit or the benefit is arguable. So we're laying it out starting today, and we had a meeting last time. We talked about the generalities that we're going to cover in a lot of general sense, and now we're becoming specific. And so I'd like for Sean to make his presentation. Upon conclusion, Amar will just have some items to conclude from his point of view as an engineer and looking at the finances. And then there are some things that I have to discuss, and the attorney needs to apprise the council of an executive session. So thank you for this period of time, and we hate to go back and start so far in the back, but it's really important to understand how we got here. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cox. Mr. Mayor, Council, Mr. Cox is probably more qualified than I to get back into the history of the VVWRA, but the PowerPoint just contains some talking points on that. But it also makes reference to the binder that you have, where you have copies of all of the relevant agreements between the city and the VVWRA as it pertains to many of the issues that I'm going to be touching on. I'm not going to go down through every single and just read the PowerPoints, but you have a history of the JPA that goes back to its formation in 1977, and with various revisions, the latest being in 1997. You have a copy of that in your binder for reference. That is the current version that we work from. In Exhibit B in the package is the proposed JPA, which results from the more recent, in the past several years, the more recent efforts to amend the JPA. Associated with that, then, again, back in history, there's a service agreement. The proposed JPA, the proposed amendment to the JPA, would cause a termination of the service agreement, but it has its own history. The latest revision was in 2005. You have that in Exhibit C in your binder.
Sean, can I ask you to speak a little more directly into the, so we can hear you better?
Sure. Sorry about that. It may cause me not to look at you then.
That's all right.
Moving on, there's a reclaimed water service agreement that was entered into in 1998 with the City of Victorville. That was for the sale of reclaimed water from the regional plant. That Victorville would then have the right to use it for irrigation purposes. Initially, that was the initial task, was to get reclaimed water to the West Winds Golf Course for irrigation purposes. There was subsequent amendments, the latest of which was in 2005, and that one established a cost for that reclaimed water of $35 per acre foot, plus we would pay pumping costs. And the various amendments and the agreement itself are in Exhibit D of the package. So a little bit of history then on the city's wastewater treatment plant. Back in, I think the negotiations started in 2007, and Keith Metzler had given a little bit of the history of that the last time. But the city entered into a wastewater capacity agreement with Dr. Pepper in August of 2008, and an OPA, owner participation agreement. The city then was on the hook to go ahead and build a wastewater treatment plant. We started design in August of 2008. The initial, while the design hadn't been fully completed, there was enough components that allowed us to move forward with equipment purchases, and finally construction contract. We actually started moving dirt in June of 2009, and finally in July of 2010 we actually started treating wastewater.
John, if I could stop you for a second. You're going through your paper PowerPoint, not the computer PowerPoint.
I'll try and catch up. Good catch. That's why I gave council both paper copy and... Am I caught up? Okay. So, as part of the overall plan for the wastewater treatment plant, the issue at the time was how to get rid of the sludge, and it was clear to us that the most cost-effective way to do that was to discharge to VVWRA. The location of the plant, maybe I should attempt to get over to our map. So on your screens is kind of an overall of where the wastewater treatment plant is. I'm trying to see if my pointer, does my pointer show up on your screens? Yeah. Okay. So where the pointer is located is where the wastewater treatment plant is. Moving over to the right, you can see the VVWRA wastewater treatment plant. The industrial wastewater treatment plant sits almost 200 feet higher than VVWRA, and so it made sense for us to choose that location to be able to deliver the reclaimed water without having to pump it back up from VVWRA. The location also is where the Adelanto Interceptor line crosses George Air Force Base from west to east, and then heads down into the location of the VVWRA. That was planned for our emergency discharge in the event of problems at the wastewater treatment plant. So we initiated discussions in September of 2008 to try and get a sludge agreement. Contract was put together in December of 2008 and submitted to VVWRA. However, it wasn't heard until January. I think there was winter storms that cancelled the VVWRA meeting in December. So in January, it was decided by the board the VVWRA board that they would want to do an analysis of what the cost of treating the sludge should be. So they spent $20,000 and ordered a solids handling study. So over the next 5 months, with various iterations, we finally arrived at an agreed upon connection fee and a treatment rate. And I guess in an attempt to show good faith, VVWRA adopted a resolution in April, which was intended to be, if you like, to keep the city of Victorville comfortable that we were making progress on a sludge agreement. Unfortunately, one of the contingencies associated with the adoption of that resolution was that the JPA had to be amended.
Wait, would you run that by me again?
One of the contingencies associated with the approval in concept of the sludge agreement was an amendment to the JPA.
But was there anything binding to move ahead at this time on the sludge agreement, or that was just almost a handshake, or what?
This was part of what we've been dealing with the past 2 years, is trying to get the VVWRA board to approve a sludge agreement. What they...
I'm going to, if I can, Mr. Mayor and Council, the Victor Valley Wastewater Authority has the authority to approve a sludge agreement by a majority vote of the members who belong to the VVWRA. The Joint Powers Authority, Victor Valley Wastewater Board, has no authority to approve or disapprove of the JPA because the JPA members are the City of Hesperia, Town of Apple Valley, County of San Bernardino, and the City of Victorville. And once those members adopt the JPA, then it automatically affects the JPA consolidated members, which is the VVWRA. So they vote on, the VVWRA board can vote on the sludge agreement, they cannot vote on the JPA agreement amendment.
For clarification, they were tying the sludge agreement to an amendment in the JPA that would do away with the requirement that it be unanimous vote.
That was
for
okay, I got it. I'm there.
And has VVWRA ever approved a sludge agreement for anyone else in the past that we're aware of, or?
No, not that I'm aware of, but they did, in fact, and I'll get to that later on, but we do have an interim sludge agreement, a temporary sludge agreement.
Okay.
We have an interim sludge agreement, and I believe on this Thursday's VVWRA meeting, it's on that agenda. I read an email that it was supposed to be on that agenda for another extension of the temporary sludge agreement.
It's not the sludge agreement, Mr. Cox, that's the treatment agreement. There's two.
I am very sorry. I'm very sorry. I read that and I thought it was for extension of the sludge agreement.
Rudy, could you finish your thought there? Mike understood what you were saying, but I wasn't clear on that. They were tying two agreements together that shouldn't be
Actually,
tied?
we needed the sludge agreement for our plant. And, but at the same time, they were working on the JPA to change some things in the JPA that would allow us to use that diversion. But when we could never come to an agreement because they wanted to change the one of the sections that requires for, if you go out for bonding or anything of that nature, requires a unanimous vote. That means all 4 cities have to vote on it, and or for the 4-member entities have to vote on it. And the city of Victorville was not willing to give that up.
They tied two separate distinct subject matters that could stand alone either on their own. They tied them together into one agreement, and that we just
They made one contingent on the other, which you're right. They could both go down separate paths. You could do the JPA amendment by itself. You could do a sludge agreement by itself. Their condition of approving the sludge agreement was that Victorville acquiesce to the draft of the joint powers agreement that they all wanted. The concern that Victorville had with that draft was, as Rudy pointed out, it attempted to eliminate the unanimous consent requirement for revenue bond financing, and Victorville was not willing to give that up. Hence, you couldn't get the sludge agreement approved.
So in April, there was this resolution adopted giving contingent approval, subject to the amendment of the JPA by July, and that was in 2009. So it just happened that in July of 2009, BVWRA's legal counsel decided to rewrite the sludge agreement. So there was more iterations of the agreement, the sludge agreement, which, you know, cost time. So by August then, Commissioner Cabrialis was attempting to get the sludge contract to move forward by asking the board to rescind the resolution since July had passed and the JPA amendment had not occurred. But he was unable to get a second for that motion. So then some time passed as we were trying to work through the JPA. But in the meantime, the City of Victorville had to look at the contingency plan in the event that we didn't get the sludge agreement. We moved forward with the design of sludge drying beds. So we've spent probably $94,000, $95,000 on the design of the sludge ponds. Before we were getting ready to go out and bid that, because that's the $3.2 million project that Mr. Cox referred to earlier. We were actually approached by VVWRA to see if an interim sludge agreement could be worked out, and we eventually ended up doing that in May of 2010. The way it was written was there was a 15-month total life to it, but there was 9 months where the City of Victorville could dispose of the sludge from their wastewater treatment plant. All the while there was 2 options that were being worked on. One was to bring the JPA to fruition, which would allow the approval of the sludge agreement, or the VVWRA would purchase the city's wastewater treatment plant. We're still in the 9-month period. Once we get to the end of the 9-month period, that decision has to be made as to whether we continue. The decision has to be made whether the plant is going to be purchased or we get a sludge agreement. Otherwise, we have to build the sludge ponds or find some other way of dealing with the sludge at cost to us. And then that would give a further 6 months to implement the construction of those ponds. That was the way the interim agreement, the temporary sludge agreement, was structured. So there are copies of those in Exhibit B in your package. Sorry, Exhibit E, I should say. So apparently there's been a work going on since 2005 on the JPA, but the more recent efforts began in April 2009 when the VVWRA, as we just mentioned, required an amendment to the JPA as a function of getting approval of a sludge agreement. So from April of 2009 to February of 2010, there were many, many meetings that Mr. Cox had attended as part of the Strategic Advisory Committee, and myself and Amber attended most of those as well to give the technical support. So by February 2010, we believed we had reached an agreement on the verbiage. The issues that caused the most grief by the other member agencies were as Councilman Cabrialis mentioned earlier, the diversion issue and the voting requirement. The current 1997 JPA requires a unanimous vote of the board for sale of revenue bonds. The push, and that came very, very late, as I recall. I hope Mr. Coxon backed me up on that. It was about December or January when last minute the other member agencies asked for this section to be looked at, and we were almost at the end of all of the other issues. So it did come up 11th hour, and I think at that time the council stood fast on the unanimous vote that should remain. So we marched forward with approval of actually several documents, but we were putting it on the agenda when Apple Valley requested a 30-day extension. We honored that request, and finally in May, then the City of Victorville approved the amendment to the JPA. It was made subject to the approval of the other member agencies. Probably over a period of, let's see, that was in May. From May until August, the item appeared on the VVWRA agenda for an update, which gave the other member entities an opportunity to report on their actions. In May, we had circulated the JPA to the other member entities for their action. And so after August, in September of 2009, the item no longer appeared on the agenda. It made us frustrated that we didn't know what was going on, and again, it was coming to a point where we really had to make decisions. So by the I think it was let me back up. Along with the JPA amendment, there was other actions that needed to be done concurrently with that. So let's touch on the termination of the service agreement. The idea of the amended JPA, as I stated earlier, was to combine the service agreement with that. So the approval of the JPA would cause the service agreement to be terminated. So that was already handled by the City of Victorville. The Council took action on that, again subject to approval by the member agencies. In terminating the service agreement, that caused another agreement to be revisited, and that was the agreement for reclaimed water service. There was a revision in that agreement needed because the termination of the service agreement would automatically terminate the reclaimed water service agreement. We wanted to make sure that did not happen because that would give up the city's right to buy all of the reclaimed water in perpetuity and also the $35 per acre foot rate. So the amendments to the reclaimed water service agreement were also made and approved by City Council, subject to member agency approvals. I'm going to touch briefly on the master plan for VVWRA. That was many years in the making. One of the issues that and Mr. Cox touched on it earlier again, was the sub-regionals. There was information in the master plan by way of a technical memorandum that suggested that the sub-regionals were cheaper than the expansion of the regional facility and the expansion of the interceptor line which goes through the river. It's actually the one that had a failure and spilled into the river. We went through many meetings and iterations on that. We had provided our own analysis, shared it with them. I'm skipping through that quickly because there's quite a bit of detail on it. All of that information is in Exhibit F. There was a request for additional information on the sub-regionals, and VVWRA actually denied us access to that information, even though it was information that was being paid for by VVWRA. And as a member entity, we believed we had every right to ask for it and receive it. They made us go through a public records request, which resulted in a denial of that information based upon the fact that it was in draft form and not subject to public disclosure. As I said earlier, the $29 million cost differential is something that is still being worked on as we speak, so there's no complete resolution on that. All that information, though, is in Exhibit F of your package. So we'll go back to the...
John, has VVWRA acknowledged that $29 million cost difference? Or do they dispute that?
Yes and no, in that without getting into the details of it, I think they, in concept, they acknowledged that there was probably a different way to look at it, and the way we looked at it was trying to compare apples to apples. What we saw in the technical memorandum did not appear to be apples to apples.
On April 10th.
Yes, it should be here. Thank you.
Documents are not becoming public. Back a couple of pages. April 2009, Commissioner Caballeros requested our following his period to release pre-designed documents is actually April 10th.
I stand corrected. Thank you, Mr. Cox. So back as far as 2002, there was an intent for VVWRA and the city to work together to get reclaimed water to West Winds Golf Course. As part of the application process to Lahontan, VVWRA received a protest from the California Department of Fish and Game. That caused about a year of negotiations. Fish and Game's concern was that withdrawing a discharge to the river could have a harmful impact on the riparian habitat. And so there was a compromise reached where there would be a minimum of 9,000 acre-feet per year discharged into the Mojave River, plus any growth beyond the base year. There would be a commitment of 20% of that growth flow would also be committed to the river to allow quantification of how much goes to the river and how much is available for reclaimed use. So I've cited the MOU with between California Department of Fish and Game and VVWRA, and that's in Exhibit G. From that, that allowed the project to move forward. So the pipeline was built by the City of Victorville in '04, and that was Purple Pipe from the Wastewater Reclamation Authority's facility all the way back up the hill. I think it's about 2.5 miles to the storage pond at the West Winds Golf Course. And so by March of 2005, then we began really the first reclaimed water project in the Victor Valley, and it's still being used today. The ultimate goal of the industrial wastewater treatment plant at SCLA was to produce reclaimed water that we would use on West Winds instead of purchasing VVWRA water. and to provide cooling water for the High Desert Power Project. Those negotiations continued with HDPP. Obviously, they had to get permit approvals, first of all from CEC and also Lahontan. And then we entered into an agreement with HDPP to provide that water in September 2010. Down at the bottom of this is, we're going to discuss that in a little bit more detail, but part of the problem that we had with our treated water was that the total dissolved solid content of it was high. And that is because of the processed water discharged from Dr. Pepper. That caused a notice of violation from VVWRA. We met with them and we met with Dr. Pepper, and suffice to say we are continuing to work through those issues. The problem is that that TDS causes us problems in our ability to sell that water then to the High Desert Power Project. And I'll get into that in a little bit more detail. Just to give you an idea, the water that we treat is discharged. It's clean water, but it's high in TDS as far as the HDPP agreement is concerned. The 860 milligram number is our discharge historically since July of last year. Most recent data is it's under 800, around the 770 mark. So it is getting better with the different actions that we have going. The other way of dealing with it is through blending, or we would end up buying some VVWRA effluent to try and blend that out. I think Mr. Cox has covered this somewhat, but I've put down some discussion points here again. VVWRA was facing some regulatory requirements as far as upgrades to the plant. In November 2010, they applied for a $24 million state revolving fund loan to implement the upgrades necessary. City of Victorville did support that, always has. There is an indication, though, that in order to repay that loan, that VVWRA will have to increase their rate from $2,200 per million gallons, which is the current rate, to $2,600 per million gallons. What that would do is the 24 million would be used to implement the construction of an ultraviolet system, helical skimmers, and rebuild the primary clarifiers. All of that we agreed was work that needed to get done. The other issues that they have is once we divert more flow into our wastewater treatment plant, that's less flow going to VVWRA, and as Mr. Cox so eloquently stated earlier, that reduction in flow causes an increase in the cost, and that's something that is a point of contention with the other member entities. And again, as mentioned earlier, the issues for finding the funding for the sub-regional plants, which VVWRA would own and finance, is something that they continue to work on.
One question. That funding for the sub-regional plants, does that require Victorville's approval?
That's a very good question. If it is revenue bond sale, my understanding is it requires a unanimous vote. I would defer to the attorneys as to whether there would be a similar unanimous vote required for any other kind of financing.
Our read of the agreement as currently drafted is that it would only be to the extent they rely on revenue bond financing, but that is going to probably be the most likely source of financing they would have to use.
They don't have revenue streams to pay for that now without financing.
Yeah.
No, absolutely
We have, during the managers group discussion on this, I had made the inquiry 15, 16 months ago, if it was possible for Apple Valley and/or Hesperia to build their own plants. And to them, it was an improbable question, because if they're a member of the Victor Valley Wastewater Authority and they're paying fees, and the Victor Valley Wastewater Authority is willing to build and operate the plants, at that point in time, there was no reason for those two communities, municipalities, to even consider paying for the plants as Victorville had paid for the plant in Victorville. To my knowledge, there's never been any financial feasibility study completed by VVWRA or Apple Valley or Hesperia as to whether or not they could do that in the realms of, what cities can do. They obviously can build their own plant and arrive at some kind of a discharge agreement with VVWRA. But I believe, based upon all the discussions that we have held during the negotiations, their intent is to move ahead with the authority, VVWRA, building and operating those two sub-regional treatment plants. And to do so would require Victorville to vote in the affirmative to enter into the kind of debt to raise the capital to build those plants.
Okay. If
Just a little background. This whole thing started years ago, and there have been continuous presentations where there was a model where if they built the sub-regionals, then the cost for expansion at the regional would be less. But as Sean indicated, we didn't know all the numbers, but now that he has numbers to indicate that that's not correct, that it would cost more to do the sub-regionals and also to do whatever we need to do to maintain the plant.
Do we have any idea how many services, sewer service connections there are in those two, in Apple Valley and Hesperia? What portion of their population is connected?
we have about 33,000 connections, and we are about 2/3 of the flow. So that means combined they have about 22,000 connections.
Out of a total number of,
And their flows are very, very similar.
Those are what?
Each community, the town of Apple Valley and Hesperia, their total flow is about the same.
but do we know what portion of their communities are connected to the sewer? And what portion are still on septic?
I don't know that off the top of my head.
I mean, if the ratio is the same, it'd be about 16,000 split between Hesperia and Apple Valley, roughly. I mean, assuming that the ratios you just gave us was correct.
Yes.
I don't, maybe one has more than the other.
Well, don't forget that the total flow that goes to the Victor Valley Wastewater Authority also includes CSA 42 and 64. There's not much flow from the Oro Grande area, but there's substantial flow from the Spring Valley Lake area. That's also a flow that gets subtracted from the Hesperia Apple Valley flow that you're discussing.
Okay, so I've just included a schematic to try and make sure that everybody understands how the industrial wastewater treatment plant was intended to function, and hopefully it's self-explanatory. The green lines are the sewer lines, The city built, in conjunction with the wastewater treatment plant, 3 sewer lines. 1 was dedicated industrial and 2 were sanitary, and east and the west side is what we refer to them. Those lines go into the wastewater treatment plant. What comes out the other side is the purple pipe, and some of that was pre-existing, but the only one that's not in is the dashed one going north towards what we depict as VV2. That's the Victorville 2 power plant location, and there's property that the city owns adjacent to those, to that, and that's something that is an issue, and I'll come to that again shortly. The sludge ponds, again, that would be proposed to be on property that the city does own, and it's immediately adjacent to it's on the same parcel of land as the wastewater treatment plant. So both reclaimed water from VVWRA and from our wastewater treatment plant can be delivered to the 2 storage facilities. One is the pond, the old pond by the West Winds Golf Course. Right next to that is the elevated storage tank. Contains capacity is about 1 million gallons, and we can pump from the pond up into the elevated storage to cause the VVWRA water and the city's reclaimed water to be mixed. Councilman Rothschild, you had a question?
Yeah, just again, so I didn't miss that, Spring Valley Lake, those connections that's in the county, is that part of the flow to VVWRA, or is that separate?
All of that, there is a county component that flows to VVWRA from Spring Valley Lake.
That's a substantial amount of that, too, of that 1/3 that's left. That 16,000 connections, 6,000 could be in the Spring Valley Lake area.
Yeah, I just don't know those exact numbers off the top of my head, but it's not insignificant, but it is. It's maybe 300,000 or 400,000 gallons.
The
numbers are
become
available.
more and more significant when you start talking about the financial responsibilities of the 2 regionals versus improving the central plant here. As I'm starting to get a grapple on the numbers here now, that component right there belonging to the counties is, again, a part that belongs to VVWRA flowing into the main plant, but it's not a part of the equation of customer-based service that would belong to Apple Valley and Hesperia. You go to the banks for bonding and stuff, they're going to, one of the things they're going to ask those communities, how many customers have you got lined up for future growth? And I think it's substantially less than would be acceptable by any bank. That's just purely a guess, but okay.
This was the numbers of the flow from Hesperia, Town of Apple Valley, Spring Valley Lake. The numbers from each entity are available, and they're not metered for. I'm going to ask Sean to explain the metering system, because what I believe in a metering system is if I look at a water meter and you know exactly how much water you're being used, but the way the communities are metered are different. And Sean, if you just touch on that, please.
Yes. About 3 times each year, there's a company that's hired to go out and they install flow meters inside manholes at the point of connection, or the multiple points of connection from each community to the VVWRA interceptor. That flow metering is totaled and compared with the master meter at VVWRA, and a proration from that is used then against the total flow for billing to each community as far as their proportionate share of that flow.
Sean, help me a little bit with your diagram here. If I'm understanding, we pump from VVWRA to the power plant and to the pond?
It can be done that way. It starts to get a little bit complicated, but certainly if all we want to do is to pump into the pond, we can close a valve and it'll pump to the pond. But in actuality, if we want some of that VVWRA water to go straight to the power plant, then we can close another valve and make sure that all of that water gets to the power plant.
But does this indicate that from the pond, we pump it up to the elevated tank, and then from the tank, it flows to the power plant?
It can flow gravity. The idea is to be able to blend the water. Gets us the best TDS.
Then if we have excess, it's going to the perk ponds?
That's one of the issues we're coming to in a minute. The excess water is a problem until we get the TDS under control. Otherwise, we're discharging it back down to VVWRA, and then we have to pay. It's 20% of the treatment rate, but it's still.
But it's paying again to treat water that's been treated.
That's right.
The reason that the reason that you show on that schematic that you're looking at, the reason that Adelanto is shown on the west side as a flow to the VVWRA is that when the VVWRA was originally formed, Adelanto was a member. And in the late 90s, Adelanto decided that they would withdraw and build their own treatment plant. The guidelines and or the actual JPA that was signed provided at that time that there would be two accounting systems. One is for the operation and maintenance of the plant, and two for capital improvements. And so the amount of money that Victorville was collecting and passing through to the VVWRA, as well as Adelanto, Victorville, and Town of Apple Valley, was that money was to be put in a capital account, and the Joint Powers Authority provided that if an entity decided to withdraw from a JPA, if it had assets, it could take those assets with them. Adelanto requested to withdraw, and there was a substantial amount of money in the capital account at that time. There was discussion back and forth, but because it was designed that if an individual decided to drop out, and they had bought capacity, and they had money in the capital account that was future capacity, there was no reason to leave it there. They actually had capacity, and by taking the money back, it increased the capacity for the remaining members, that being Victorville County, Town of Apple Valley, and Hesperia. And therefore, Adelanto withdrew and received an amount of money for that capacity. And it was kind of a fear at that time that if Victorville withdrew from the VVWRA, because of the amount of money that was there, that it would really close the plant or collapse the plant because there was not sufficient revenue from the county, Apple Valley, or the city of Hesperia to continue the operation of the plant because of its design and the load and the efficiency in operating at that flow. There was no plans on Victorville's part to withdraw at that time. As far as I know, I was an alternate to the VVWRA at that time, and actually then became a member representing the city for a length of time, and I don't recall the time period, but it was also during the period of time where Adelanto wanted to withdraw. And I can remember arguing to Apple Valley and Hesperia that if you decide to withdraw and build your own plant, you have a significant amount of capital that you can take because you have purchased. You have capital in the capital account for future expansion of the plant. The plant as it existed at that time had been paid for by the following methods. A federal grant, a state grant, combined together 87.5%, 12.5% that was a voter-approved bond issue paid on the property tax. And therefore, that built the whole plant. And then there was an agreement that was signed based upon the flows and the amount of money that's paid that determined the ownership of the plant at that time. And it was true that if any entity had withdrawn, they would have a substantial amount of money to build their own capital, release additional plant capacity in this plant. Again, I'm not aware of any discussion at that time that the City of Victorville had any discussions or any alterations to discuss withdrawing from the plant, but Victorville was very aware of a huge amount of capital, I believe it was $24 or $26 million, that was in that fund, and therefore, because Victorville had gone its ups and downs and knew that when the recession was over there would be substantial growth and particularly because at that time, there was a plan to bring industry to the base. It was well known that there would need to be a very effective treatment plant that would need to be expanded. For the council's information, I resigned at the end of '99, and even though I stayed on as a free consultant for a couple of months, I did not work for the city since 2000. I was unaware until I came back to the city and was appointed back to the DVWRA as the alternate member, that all of the capital money had been expended for O&M, which should never have occurred. And while some people argue that, well, Victorville was the biggest beneficiary because they actually have the 68 to 70% of the flow, and Victorville had paid most of the money in the capital account, that the benefit actually came back to Victorville. And that kept the city council.
Does that mean that the revenue streams weren't sufficient to cover the operations and maintenance?
That's exactly what it means.
That seems exactly.
And while I heard that argument for the first time, I responded probably in error because it's an opinion not backed up by fact. If I wanted to make sure that Victorville couldn't withdraw, one way to do that is spend their money. And therefore, if Victorville wanted to withdraw, there was no assets to take, or money, or anything else. Since that's exactly what occurred, I think a reasonable person can conclude that the expenditure of the capital account from 24 to 26 million was no accident.
Were there legal restrictions on capital?
My belief is that there are, and I think that's a discussion that this council needs to have with the city attorney. It relates to the discussion on who gets a direct or indirect benefit, who gets no benefit, and I think it's a very important part of this discussion, but it shouldn't be discussed at this point.
So if I may, I just want to finish off on this slide with just some statistics. What we're treating through the wastewater treatment plant today is about 500,000 gallons. Of that, there is 150,000 gallons of processed waste from Dr. Pepper. They also, though, discharge another 150,000 gallons, maybe a little less, of sanitary waste, but there's also some what's known as RO reject water in that. So it's not sanitary waste, but it's not processed waste either. And then in addition to that, we have about another 170,000 gallons coming from SCLA itself, plus a portion of the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and it would be the smaller portion. So if you take a look at the slide, the SCLA and FBOP, that flows to our wastewater treatment plant today, as does the DPSG, the red rectangle on the left. The pentagon shape with Westside City, there is another close to 600,000 gallons a day that we could divert from its current trunk line and send it to the wastewater treatment plant. It literally is a few days' work and $5,000 or $10,000 to flip that switch. That would basically bring us to a little over 1 million gallon a day facility. The benefits to doing that would be to help blend out the high TDS that we're getting from Dr. Pepper, and also from a revenue standpoint, it is more positive. The other thing that...
Does that solve the sludge problem? Can we then deliver sludge to BVWRA?
The sludge agreement that we have with them is temporary, and so we would be able to do that until that agreement expires. That was the 15-month agreement that we talked about earlier. After that point in time, the city needs to have found another way of disposing of sludge, either by sludge ponds, there are sludge reactors, there's just hauling it, but that's great cost, and we'll get into that in the next slide or two.
Is there a possibility to have a long-term temporary agreement that renews?
I do believe that's possible. I think that there's going to be a lot of negotiations, and I think there's going to be a lot of give and take, and that's certainly something that could be put on the table. One item before I forget, the line going from Adelanto to the VVWRA, Adelanto did build their plant. Their plant is currently failing, and therefore they have an agreement with VVWRA to flow sewage into the VVWRA plant. It's being treated at their plant, but it doesn't meet all the requirements. There's some hot and discharge requirements that they're mandated to correct, and so until they can get that corrected, it's treated and then flowed into VVWRA at a reduced rate. But generally, there's been a lot of good cooperation to do things for the member entities, and while Adelanto is no longer a member of VVWRA, and everyone agreed to help, we are a member, and they agreed for the temporary sludge agreement. So Commissioner Camarillas has been able to put forth good arguments on behalf of the city for the things that we're doing. But the problem that we face is that we're coming up with a huge bond issue to build the plants, and we're coming up with a sludge agreement we don't have that's going to expire. And so there's a lot of issues, and we're sorry to dump them on you, but we feel the longer we wait, the worse this could get. Now, I don't think that you're not quite through, but I just want to point out that a part of the agreements, not the sludge agreements, but a part of the water, that was designed to go from the new plant, which was the industrial wastewater treatment plant, to the high desert power plant. I want to touch on that just a little bit. Back when the permits were being issued for the plant, the water for Power Plant 1, that we call Power Plant 1 at the base, actually was purchased from the city of Victorville, but we purchased it from the MWA. And the water that they use for cooling comes directly out of the aqueduct. There is a line from the aqueduct that passes the George Air Force Base and then continues on and provides water to the Barstow area. It's the way to get water down the river. So there is an agreement that purchases an amount of water, and they have Power Plant 1 has a treatment plant. And the treatment plant treats the water from the aqueduct, and then they use it for cooling. That aqueduct water is an interruptible supply of water. And in order for them to have the permits, because if somebody's going to rely on the electricity, it has to be an uninterruptible source. In other words, there has to be water flowing. They can't notify people that they have a power purchase agreement with, or the state, or, hey, we're going to shut your water off because the aqueduct is down for treatment. They entered into agreements with the Victorville Water District to inject water, treat the water and inject it into the ground, and then bring it out during the times that they need it. And they could pump up to 9,000 acre feet, I believe, but I think it was restricted to 3,000 acre feet at a time. That's kind of not on the board anymore, because the only way that they can really have an uninterrupted supply is to have Victorville wells to back them up only in case of needs with the water they put in the ground, and to have reclaimed water from plants that operate. Plants that operate to treat the sewage must operate 24/7, and so there's an amount of reclaimed water that would be available. A part of that agreement then for the rates for Power Plant 2 was also to use reclaimed water, because they couldn't get the permits for an interruptible source. In other words, they couldn't get the permits to build the plant and operate it if they took water out of the aqueduct. Whether or not you agree with that, how that was negotiated or not, what it did initially was it not only didn't take water from our basin, it actually took water from the aqueduct and pumped water into the basin. So most water people that have looked at that agreement thought that it was good. The amount of additional water now that's being pumped, the reclaimed water is a policy of the state legislature, and so the agreement was worked out that Power Plant 1 would use reclaimed water, and if they ever build Power Plant 2, it would use reclaimed water. There have been many different individuals working on that, and I don't know who gets the credit for that, but when the city of Victorville combined the water district, the combined Victor Valley Water District and the Baltimore Mesa Water District into the Victorville Water District, the negotiations for the reclaimed water issue was turned over to Reggie Lamson, who was the general manager of the water district, and I quite frankly left it up to Amr and John and Keith, who was very much involved in why the plant needed to be built for Dr. Pepper Snapple and the Reclaim Water Agreement. And the Reclaim Water Agreement was moved forward. A little bit of an additional subject the attorney will speak to you about in executive session. But the Reclaim Water Agreement was the intent of taking water from the industrial wastewater plant and provide water directly to them. At the current time, because of the total dissolved solids exceed the amount that they can accept, is why they can't take it direct, and it's got to be indirect or blended or mixed with water from VVWR8. A little more of a cost. We can meet our obligation. We've discussed this with the attorney. It will not produce the revenues that we initially thought to go into a capital account to make further improvements. But by following that, it will meet our obligation. When Reggie Lamson left the city, Amr Jaker took that over, and a part of his analysis is concerns that he have in regard to the cost, the operating cost, the threat of diversion, the possible litigation, the requirements that we provide reclaimed water for cooling for Power Plant 1. And he's very concerned that rather than wait down the road and then something not work, or the reclaimed water gets shut off, or it can't be provided from VVWA for other issues, he doesn't want to be standing there with no excuses on why we can't provide it. And so he's gotten right in the middle of this and essentially said, stop until we get this worked out. Because while we can keep going, we're simply kicking the problems down the road, and sooner or later they're going to come forth, and he would like to have those come forth now so that staff and council can deal with those in a meaningful way so that it isn't something haunting us out in the future. And so once he has stepped in for Reggie Lamson and assumed those responsibilities and assumed the responsibilities for the reclaimed water and the sewage portion of it, he has expressed some concerns that need to be addressed by both staff and by council, and thus his concern.
Did I understand that the diverted flow from city sources into that plant would impact the TDS and
It's the
prove
other,
that
it's the other
one?
way. It's effective. I believe the theory is that if you divert, we're operating right now with the flow, I believe, only or almost only from the Dr. Pepper plant. And their discharge is very high in total dissolved solids. It was Reggie Lamson's belief that if you have total dissolved solids that are corrosive in nature, which salts are, that would be the big fear. And not only it wouldn't work in the treatment plant, it would be very difficult to get the total dissolved solids down. And I believe the standard for power, I'm probably getting into Amr's presentation here further, getting it down to the wastewater, or to the power plant, is 450 parts per million. That's a substantial reduction, but if you mix, a spoon of salt in an ounce of water, it's totally different than a spoon of salt in a gallon of water, but it's the same amount of salt. So the total dissolved solids, once you blend, you dilute that substantially. And so it is the discussion of staff, and Sean has recommended that he be able to take the prison flow and put it into the plant, and the west side flow and put it into the plant. And that will get that down to a point where the blending of the reclaimed water from VVWA could probably meet the standards. It's his best belief, although we're not so specific that we're willing to say it absolutely will. But that needs to be done because the moment that we come to the city council, we believe, and say we'd like to allocate monies to start this diversion, we think we're probably running into a lawsuit. We can't afford to be held up. We need to get these things resolved, and that's why we're just laying it out, because that's been an underlying threat to the staff in trying to negotiate the agreement based upon the fact that the BVWA plant is operating at an efficient level. And based upon the flow, it can fluctuate up and down, as all flows do to wastewater plants. but it doesn't affect the plant too much because the overall average is going to remain the same. They have the average daily flows, and therefore the manpower and the chemical and the energy needs are going to remain average throughout the year. It's been the argument of the manager of the BVWRA that when we divert, and I think he's considered the diversion about 20%, as I recall, but I think it's 18. So anyway, whatever it is, that reduces the flow, but the manpower remains the same, and the energy remains the same, and there's a small reduction in chemical cost, and therefore the cost to treat 1 million gallons goes up by the same ratio of 16 to 18%. And that originally started the controversy when the representatives of the BVWRA said, how can I go back and tell the citizens of my town that we're going to increase our rates, whatever that number is, 16, 18%, so Victorville can have their own plant? We can't do that. Well, I reminded them that we went into a recession, and the flow was reduced almost 2,000 gallons a day. Do we hold a gun on everybody's head and say, even though you lost your house, you got to stay there and flush it so that you can remain efficient and effective? All the businesses that close the business, do we go get them and bring them back and say, no, you got to open your business where you want to or not, because otherwise the cost goes up? I said it was a ridiculous argument. I still believe it is, but they actually hired a consultant that substantiated, well, yes, it's true. But we've talked to consultants that said, well, we can give you a report that says it's not true, which we don't need to be spending money because to hire a consultant, because the charge is going to be we hired a consultant to say what we wanted them to say. If you believe that, then you have to believe also then that they hired a consultant to say what they wanted them to say. And you can't have it both ways. So we've avoided going there in hopes that we could come to an agreement and get this thing settled. We just can't get there, and that we're just coming to the end. I mean, we have the Dr. Pepper plant up and going. We have an agreement to provide water to Power Plant 1. And we have the BVWRA moving full speed ahead to build the plants in Hesperia and Apple Valley. And I asked this following question. If they had a consultant that said, when the flow is reduced, cost goes up, if Apple Valley and Hesperia skim and take the reclaimed water and put it on parks, golf courses, or whatever, reduces the flow, the cost goes up. You can't have it both ways. And we can't get any place by saying, sit down at the table and be reasonable. You're only doing what we're doing, so the cost remains relatively the same. I'm just tired of arguing the point. It's time that we have a third party that's totally independent, that can answer the question that has credibility, because apparently we don't, because we just get met with a blank stare. And it's time we bring that to this council's attention also, because at this point in time, even though a comment was made by a member very closely associated with BVWRA that we're diverting and as a result has run the cost up, we haven't diverted anything at this point in time. So I want to clarify that, even though the statements have been made.
Can you repeat that, Jim? I didn't follow everything you just said.
Well, because of the issue about diverting causes the cost to go up. I was in a meeting where a member very close to the BVWRA made the comment that Victorville is diverting and as a result has affected the income of BVWRA. It's just simply not true. I just need to clarify that.
We haven't deferred anything yet, right?
Effectively not. We have intercepted flows, taken them through our plant, but that same water is ending up in VVWRA. We can only be accused of diversion, if you will, once we sell it to HDPP and, it's consumed.
So it's already started, so we know where we're headed on this thing. We simply need to get out ahead of it. So, I'm sorry, were you finished with
I have a couple more slides, and it does get into the kind of crucial issues for the city as it relates to the wastewater treatment plant. We've talked about the TDS, the total dissolved solids. The agreement that we have for standby treatment was initiated back when the Dr. Pepper folks asked if we could take flows in February because they felt they would be ready in February last year. Our plant wasn't ready to take it, but we agreed that we would enter into an agreement with VVWRA, and we entered into, there was a supplement to the agreement with Dr. Pepper, and we accepted their flows for that interim period of time. However, once we started treating our wastewater, we found that we still needed to be able to put that treated water somewhere, and that's where the agreement, and I think Mr. Cox is correct, it's going to come up in the next March, I think, VVWRA meeting to extend that agreement further. We did negotiate after July that the rate should only be 20% of the treatment rate due to the fact that it's already been treated by the City of Victorville. So they're basically taking clean water, it's high in TDS. That's the issue. I'll get into a little bit of why we are here, but the TDS issue was not specifically addressed in the agreement with Dr. Pepper. Dr. Pepper had revealed to us what would normally be high-strength discharge, the COD levels, and the total suspended solids levels. And those were specifically addressed in the agreement. But I think the bottom line is that nobody realized or understood just how efficient this brand new state-of-the-art Dr. Pepper plant was going to be. I believe they honestly felt that the discharge that they were going to be sending to us, the agreement was for 750,000 gallons, and I believe that was for 7 lines. Is that right, Keith? They're running 5 lines, but they're only sending, 250 to 300,000 gallons to us. That tells me, and I've heard it independently, that this plant that they built, latest, greatest state-of-the-art, is a lot more efficient than any other plant that they have. And all we had to go by when designing the plant was what the characteristics were coming out of the other plants. And so it was designed for that. The load that we were expecting was about 1,750 milligram per liter TDS, and we're getting double that, about 3,600 coming from them. And that's where the plant is really struggling to attack the TDS level. We continue to work with them. I've had conversations earlier today where they're looking at changing their chemical use to see if that's going to help the TDS level in the discharge. We're looking at what we can do internally within our plant. The TDS results from controlling the acidity of the discharge. That's done by chemical. The chemical adds TDS to the water. So we're trying to neutralize the waste by circulating it through the equalization tank. And all of these combined efforts, we are seeing a gradual reduction in that. As I mentioned earlier, the average since we started operating, TDS level of our discharge effluent was 860. We looked at just the beginning of the year, since the January 1st, it's at 770. While that's not 450, it brings us closer to be able to blend with either VVWRA water, the west side flows that we talked about that could be diverted in. It's our intent to divert it in. And then the remaining prison flow that can be brought in and blended. We're still running the numbers on that to see how that's going to come out. We believe we're getting very close to the 450 number. The other possibility is to have discussions with HDPP and see if they will take 500 instead of 450. All of these we are continuing to work on it, but we're not quite there yet. In the event that we're unable to keep discharging to VVWRA, the city needs to find somewhere to put that water. And the ultimate concept to the the full capacity of the plant is 2.5 million gallons, but we've looked at upgrades to the plant, looking out into the future to get it to about 3.5 million gallons. And the ultimate plan for percolation ponds was to have those to the north, and if you bear with me, I'll try and to the north. If you look at the yellow area on the map, those are city-owned parcels for the Victorville 2 plant, and the red is the imprint of the original concept of Victorville 2. The yellow parcels on the west side of the red boundary is where we had talked about having percolation ponds. However, that is land that is attractive to a potential buyer for the solar project. The idea of having perk ponds that far north is dictated by easier to get a permit from Lahontan. The pipeline to bring it there would be needed to serve water to Victorville 2 anyway. It's land that the city already owns. And the other thing of concern...
Have we tested that soil for percolation?
No, we have not.
So it might not even receive it.
Generally, the soils in the area are good. I do understand there are certain pockets of stuff that are not quite so suitable for percolation. I think you're probably thinking of the parcels that the Victor Valley Water
64
District...
acres that we bought.
Yeah.
I think our study said that the river bottom was a great place to percolate, but that was about it.
We were actually headed in this direction by Lahontan, and so it's not a plan that is anything more than some time in the future that might be a good location. It would make sense to have it there if we have to build a pipeline to serve Victorville 2 anyway. The other thing that was steering us that far north was the Lahontan is very much involved in the cleanup effort at former George Air Force Base. One thing they do not like is any kind of percolation of water where it may influence the plume, the contamination plume that they're trying to clean up. They felt that was far enough north that it would not impede that or affect it in any way. The other choice that the city has in getting rid of the water, whether it's the water that's high TDS or it's water that is needed to be discharged at a point in time when the power project is not operating, they will go down for maintenance. I think it's a total of 5 weeks in the year. During those 5 weeks, people are still flushing toilets, Dr. Pepper's still producing processed waste, we are still treating it, and we have to be able to get rid of that treated water somewhere. The other idea that we started working on a while ago, but it requires an NPDES permit from Lahontan, and that would be a discharge into the Mojave River. And, you know, the plan we have is cost effective. We would simply run our Title 22 water back down the purple pipe that comes up from VVWRA, and then just outside their boundary fence we would release that water into a culvert that naturally drains into the river. It would need an NPDES permit. The estimations are 9 months to a year to get that. We did start along that path quite some time ago, but we also believed that we had a customer that would buy it all, and we would have water that was saleable. And then the emergency would be discharged to VVWRA. We've recently started up that process again because it is a good plan. If we're able to do that, we may not need the percolation ponds We would need to just take a look and see the capacity of that pipe. Once we get up to 3.5 million gallon per day capacity, we may not be able to discharge that amount of water into the Mojave River in an emergency. But that would mean that there would be no users. So we kind of need to look at that and gauge how feasible that is. I mean, it is feasible for the flows today, right up to 2.5 million gallons probably, but going beyond that, we need to look at that closely. But it's a worthwhile exercise. Capital outlay is not that huge. Let me get back onto the... I think, did I skip one there? No, I think I've covered it. Maybe back up a little bit on the sludge. The disposal of the sludge is a problem in that it becomes very, very expensive to truck it. Right now, that's an alternative that we're not immediately facing. We have the interim sludge agreement for 15 months. We actually have only, I believe we've only discharged once in December, because we're not treating a huge volume of flow. So we have a means of dealing with sludge in the immediate future, but we need to make a decision whether we're going to get into another method, which is a capital outlay, or truck it away at great expense. That's a very expensive alternative. Even, I mean, the numbers I've put together on another sheet in your package, I've put in a number that represents trucking the sludge waste to VVWRA to be disposed of, just like septic. It doesn't make any sense when we can just flow that sludge down the hill on a pipe for about $300,000 construction cost, and I think it's a $550,000 connection fee. I also wanted to make sure Council understood where we're at with the construction package, if you will, for the wastewater treatment plant. The $46 million number at the top of this sheet is the budget that was approved back in June of '09 by the City Council in the infrastructure financing plan that was presented by Keith Metzler. There's been confusion, I think. The industrial wastewater treatment plant plus all of the supporting infrastructure, which would be, and I kind of showed you diagrammatically, there's about 8.5 miles of large diameter sewer pipes. There's 2.5 miles of water, gas, telephone cable that runs up that east side of the airport out to the wastewater treatment plant, and an electrical backbone system. When you look at all of that infrastructure plus the plant itself, that's what the $46 million budget was for. So the latest numbers that we have run for the construction expended to date is the 40.8 million number. For those projects that are under construction that are not completed yet, there are further expenditures of 3.4 million expected. And then there are two projects basically that we have not commenced, one being the lift station. The other issue with the lift station to take, it's close to 400,000 gallons from the prison into our wastewater treatment plant. It's about $1 million capital outlay, but we don't have a renewed contract with the Federal Bureau of Prisons yet. That's something that it's probably 2 years expired, and they keep pushing out the date for submitting a proposal, or actually, all we have now is a pre-solicitation notice. We don't have the actual solicitation yet. So it becomes a little bit difficult to recommend to City Council that we spend $1 million on a sewer lift station, and then the feds decide to build their own treatment plant. We want to get the ink on the contract before doing that. So that's one of the two projects in the 1.89 million. The other one is the sludge line and the connection fee to VVWRA. So our total projected budget with expenditures, anticipated projects, anticipated expenditures for existing contracts, we are just right at the budget number. I mean, that's just pure coincidence that we're just right there. It could go over, it could stay under. We have contingencies built into, some of these numbers. But that's the snapshot of where we're at today with the wastewater treatment plant. In your package, towards the back, the last two sheets, there is further detail on the issues that we're facing with TDS, with sludge. And I did get a little synopsis also of why those are problems. It wasn't something that was known or planned for 2 years ago when we started along this path. These things have come before us, and we're doing the best we can to get solutions to those problems. I've also laid out, as best we can at this point in time, costs associated with some of these different alternatives we have for solutions. Those numbers need to be refined. Some of them will cause additional O&M costs if those are the options that we end up with.
Thank you, John. Mr. Mayor and Council, we have a 5 o'clock executive session with our regular scheduled council meeting, and I had promised we would try to get out by 4:30, which probably means, if this is acceptable to council, or particularly the attorney, that the executive session portion of this be delayed until after the 5 o'clock meeting, because Amar is going to give a short presentation on his concerns, and that's going to get us with questions right at 4:30, and I've been requested that we have at least a half-hour break before we get into the brand-new meeting on the other issues. Amar?
Thank you, Mr. Cox. Just like it was mentioned earlier by Mr. Cox, I took over the water district, and one of the things that I started to look at was the budget, financial condition of the district. And quickly it became apparent that the treatment plant project has a big impact, one way or the other, on the budget and the future budget, operating budget of the water and the sewer systems. One thing that when we started looking at, and my staff and I, we got concerned. There was 3 or 4 different things. The main thing was the ability to finish the plant under current budget. As Mr. McLeod showed you, there's $46 million shown on that budget. But that's the budget. That's not the money available. There was a $45 million loan that was done from Water Department to the sewer fund. There is not enough money to cover that first $45 million. But even if we were to do that, we still don't have that $1.8 million that's needed to finish the project off. And then I'll get into that a little bit later on as we go through this presentation. The second thing was that there is a lot of stuff that's not done on that original project. We've, in our numbers that are shown in water and sewer budget, there's about $45 million that's spent so far, and there's another $3 million left, so that's about $48 million. But the whole idea was to be independent of VVWRA from the onset, and we're still dependent on them on being able to get agreements to discharge water one way or the other. If it's not the sewer itself or the industrial wastewater, it's the ability to discharge our Title 24 water or our sludge. We're still dependent on them. To be truly independent, we would have to finish the facility, which would cost us, by numbers that were provided by engineering department, to the tune of $11 million. And that would make us free of VVWRA. Now, we do not have that $11 million today to finish the project. The other thing that we became concerned of was, as we were looking at the rates and projecting the rates into the future, there is not enough flow that can be diverted to this plant to make this plant economical. Right now there is 300,000 gallons coming from Dr. Pepper, but they have a take or pay, so really it's independent of how much they send. We have a certain amount of money that they pay us every year. But the second portion, we only have about 170,000 gallons a day diverted. If we add the other phase where Mr. McLeod said it'll take 3 to 5 days and a cost of $5,000 to $10,000, that would get us to about $1.1 million. Doing that, we would still be twice as expensive as BVWRA on treating sewer. We really need to have this plant operational at 2 million gallons or above to compete with BVWRA's rate. They're charging us $2,200 a gallon to treat. If we treat only 1.1 million gallon and our cost is fixed with the contract that we have with the consultant, and then there's other fixed costs, our cost rises to about $5,800 per million gallon to treat the water. But that does not include the debt service for the plant itself. And that's, so without having enough sewer diverted to this plant, and without selling that water coming out of that plant for the reclaimed water, we do not have enough revenues to pay the debt service to get the loan. So we were looking at continuing the application with the state revolving fund for the loan for the $45 million to be paid back to the water district. The other option was to do bonds or look at some other type of financing. But all of these financing hinge on plant be complete, for one. Second, the rate in place to pay the bonds back. It would, the calculations that we did briefly require us to raise our rate about $5 per EDU to pay back, to have enough revenues to pay the debt service back. Now those numbers may change if we can add additional flow to the plant. It's maybe $3, maybe $4 per EDU. With that in mind, what I did is I put a little bullet points together, and I distributed a copy. It just says on top, industrial wastewater treatment plant. And within that, I listed all the issues that I was aware of. Maybe some of those issues are resolved or they can be resolved fairly shortly. But there is still ongoing issues with the plant being finished. There is some disinfection, UV disinfection issues that haven't been resolved. There's leaks of methane, there is screening systems that are not working. Those are operational issues that can be handled. But the main thing is that the flow is not completely diverted. And until that flow gets diverted, we do not have enough revenues collected that we can keep for us, rather than giving it to BVWRA to recover our cost. Second issue, we've talked about disposal of reclaimed water. We have this issue of getting TDS, and I won't get too much into that. TDS is, again, it's an issue of operation. We'll have to deal with it one way or the other when we're operating the plant. But main thing to do is to finish the plant so it's working. Then we can handle the TDS once the plant itself is operational. But even if you were to have 2.2 million gallons, let's say, of water coming into our plant, we only have an ability to sell to HDPP, the power plant. We only have the ability to sell up to 900,000 gallons a day at this time. That still leaves the issue of that 1.1 million gallon to resolve. Either a temporary agreement with the VVWRA or a permanent agreement, either way, or building the perk ponds. And then again, it goes back to, well, we don't have time for perk ponds. This flow is here and it's now, and we need to treat that. So we really need to have an agreement with the VVWRA within the next few months to be able to handle the flows. Sludge disposal is another issue. Very concerned with the trucking option or any other option, because again, there is only so much revenues we collect every year. With the revenues, we have three things that we do. We pay VVWRA a substantial portion of that revenue. 16 out of $24 rate, $16.45 go directly to VVWRA. The rest of the $8 is there for us to take care of the staff that we already have, that cleans the lines and maintains the system, the operating cost of our lines, and then again to pay for the operation of this plant. We do get $2 million a year from Dr. Pepper that goes towards operation and debt service for this plant. But that's not enough to cover the cost of operating this plant. So we do need to subsidize from the revenues that we collect. We need to subsidize this plant. So the more water we can divert into this plant, the less subsidy required to pay for this plant. Again, the FBOP lift station issue, if we can get that water lifted to our site, that's good, but if we can't get rid of that water, then we're still facing the same issue. The more water we bring, the more water we have to dispose of, and without having those agreements in place, we cannot do that very efficiently. And then, again, the TDS issue, we've talked about that various times, and Sean has gone into length, but again, to get water from BVWRA, to dilute, to get the TDS down, would mean that we would have excess water now. So bring water up from them, pump it up, dilute this water. Now we got to send it back down to them again. So we'll buy it at 35, then we have to pay 20% of the treatment cost to treat that water that we just bought, basically. So it's really not economical way. It does get us out of this bind of being able to provide water, but that's not the best or the optimum way to make money, because when we start looking at our numbers, at a certain point, we do not make money in that reclaimed water sale to HTPP because of all of this added cost to get that water to them and to have it at a certain TDS level. Again, on the water loan, I touched on that. It's $45 million loan that the water district made to the sewer portion of sewer district. Most of that money has already been spent. And there are some projects on the books, and our concern is that if we keep going with those projects and we finished everything that's on the CIP, we would be quite a bit in negative at the end of the year in water and sewer accounts. So our goal is to delay some of those projects. Some of them are related to the treatment plant, some are not, but they would have to be delayed, moved on to next year or the year after, so we do not get into the issues with the budget for next year or the year after. And again, that our biggest concern is the amount of money needed to finish the plant. If it takes another $11 million to finish the plant, that means that's additional amount of money that we need to borrow. That means additional revenues would have to be raised through rates to pay for that $11 million back to the fund, whichever fund that lends that money to finish that portion of. Now, if we don't, then if we can get agreements with the BVWRA, then that's good, but then that takes us back to the same spot where we were, because it's the agreements with the lack of ability to have agreements with BVWRA was the reason we started this path to build the plant. And if we have to go back to them and pay high prices on these agreements to get the water issue resolved, then we really haven't gained much. And then the other cost is we would like to bring the cost of treatment down again by diverting as much flow as we can to get this thing done, where we do not have to raise rates substantially to pay for this plant. As far as the options, we've even looked at not running the plant, just pre-treating flows coming from Dr. Pepper, bringing it into our plant, and then just letting it go down. That's 150,000 gallons of the 300,000 that they're sending us. It's not a lot of flow in scheme of things. So if we were to just pre-treat that at our plant, it would be a lot cheaper than to even going through all of this stuff. We would just need a minor agreement. And I calculated the cost of connection fees is a lot less. It's in the range of a few $1 million to pay to BVWRA to let us connect Dr. Pepper to them and then directly pay them for treating water, Dr. Pepper. Now, that means the plant itself would sit empty for a while, but at least we wouldn't be running up the bill in operating cost of the plant, and we're able to divert the flows as it comes in the future. We can divert from the west side. We can divert a lot of flows into our plant and then start using it. But we do need to, from our perspective, we do have these three issues: the ability to finish the project, the ability to divert additional flow to make this thing functional, and then ability to have debt service revenues. Because in the long term, Those are the three things that we need to resolve for water and sewer department or funds to stay healthy. So that's basically my analysis of the situation, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer.
Thank you, Almer. I know there's going to be questions from the mayor and council as we proceed with this. There's some very significant issues that do require executive session items. I'm only mentioning this because I think it was mentioned publicly before, and I hope it was, but it's an issue. There was back in some time ago, there was a study by a consultant that indicated that the reason that Victorville couldn't divert the flow is because the JPA agreement provided that each agency is obligated to send all its wastewater flow to VVWRA. The attorney has looked at that and issued a private legal opinion to staff that that's not the case. Request that he cover that in the council with the executive session. There is a distinct difference. Just another reason that we believe that potential litigation, or more than potential. Initially, we were told, initially I was told that there was a requirement that all the entities send all of its wastewater to the VVWRA. I reminded from the house to the septic tank was wastewater, and there was no intent of any entity to divert that from the septic tanks into the flow, and if that was the requirement, and that then got changed to wastewater flow. So it doesn't become a flow until it goes into the sewer pipe. So it exempts all the areas that are not sewered. On the other hand, there's probably a time that we take a look at a joint meeting with Lawton to make a determination what the effect of thousands of septic tanks have on the groundwater. There's all kinds of issues. I'm not suggesting it. I'm saying it's it's alternate number 13 or something. But there's a lot here. There's an awful lot here, and we need to get on this, and we need to get on it very quickly. A lot of issues are here. Staff needs direction. Really needs direction. There may be a little difference of opinion on the staff. It's, as I said before, it's a professional opinion. And when Amr came to me and realized that suddenly he's been put in charge of an entity that he's not sure how it's going to end up June 30, he is a little bit nervous about the fact that he may end up with a negative balance. Hand him a responsibility and then blame him later because it's negative. He wanted to make sure that I understood all the facts and figures as we proceeded, but I'm very well aware of all the problems and the possible solutions, except that at this point in time, I think staff has to stop until we clear all these things with the council. I know in executive session, Mr. Cavallaro has information that he can also share with the council that comes out of his executive sessions with VVWRA that he can't discuss openly. But there has been a ruling that he may discuss it. Each member entity of the JPA can discuss with their entities in executive session items. So at that point, we'd request it's 4:30. We need to stop at this point if that's okay, and take a break, and then executive session gets moved, adjourned, or something, assuming we have time with the regular agenda items.
All right, how are we going to handle this since it was scheduled?
Madam McEachran, I would continue this part of the discussion. You're apparently, Jim, I believe we're finished with the public section. You have on your agenda for the 2:30 meeting also closed session. We would continue that until, I would say, the conclusion of the 5 o'clock closed session. So hopefully we can get it done before the regular meeting starts at 7 o'clock.
All right, then we'll go ahead and continue this meeting in the closed session portion of this meeting and to the conclusion of the closed session at 5 o'clock.
Correct.